Alright, so today I want to talk about Ball Python maternal incubation, where the female wraps around the eggs and incubates them and hatches them out all by herself without any intervention from the breeder. And I always was under the assumption that it's a pretty bad idea to let the female ball python hatch out her own eggs, and I actually went over to YouTube, did a search for Ball Python maternal incubation, and I was actually surprised at how many people have tried it, and most people have pretty good success letting the female ball pythons hatch out their own eggs. So in this video, I kind of wanted to show you the pros and cons of letting the female hatch out her own eggs versus taking them away and putting them in an incubator. And essentially what I do is I always take the eggs away from the female. I've never attempted maternal incubation, and what I do is I put them in a hatching box like this one right here. So this is like a 6-cord shoe box that I bought. I think I bought these on eBay. You can also buy them on Amazon. I'll actually post a link below for some of these boxes. And then what I did is there's several different ways you can set up a hatching box. I actually use, it's called egg crate, like this plastic square. As a matter of fact, I actually use this for some fluorescent lights in some buildings. And this one actually, I bought it over on eBay. It was perfectly sized for these. I think I only cut out the corners on this and it slipped right in here. And essentially what I do is I take the egg box and I fill it 50-50 by weight with water and vermiculite. I think it's like 200 grams of water, 200 grams of vermiculite, mix it together really well on the bottom, and then I put the egg crate on top, and then I put press and seal over the top to hold in all the humidity, and then I just put the top on. You really don't need the top. The only reason I use the lid on these is so I can stack them in my incubator. I usually stack them up as I go through the breeding season. And I actually put together a list of 10 pros and cons that you should consider before you decide to do maternal incubation and let your female incubate her own eggs. And the number one, the pro, as a matter of fact, a lot of new people just getting into ball pythons, they're probably like, hey, the biggest thing that's a pro as far as letting the female incubate her own eggs is that you don't need an incubator, which I've seen a lot of people, they'll actually buy one snake or just a couple snakes, and they'll breed it for the first time, and they're not set up for an incubator or anything. They're like, hey, why don't we just let the female incubate the eggs? I'd say that's probably where most of the people start out, breeding ball pythons. They don't have an incubator, and they just have this female that laid eggs, and they decide to do maternal incubation where they let the female hatch out the offspring, which is an advantage. You don't need an incubator. But let me tell you, if you actually have an incubator, it's pretty easy to put one together. There's a lot of different really inexpensive incubators that I've seen. As a matter of fact, probably the cheapest one that I've seen is I've seen people do like one of those really cheap styrofoam coolers. You can buy them really inexpensive, just a really flimsy styrofoam cooler. And then I've seen a lot of people put water on the bottom and then throw in a fish heater, like an aquarium heater, in the water and keep the water at 90 degrees on the bottom. And then they'll put in like some kind of a grate or something on the bottom so that it keeps it at 90 degrees in the styrofoam cooler. Kind of the cheapest kind of configuration I've ever seen as far as kind of making your own incubator. And you can pretty much go, as expensive as you want to go. I don't really think there's too many incubators that you can get that are prefabricated. I'd say most people build their own incubators. I actually built one out of a beverage cooler, and I think I can hold maybe about 20 clutches of eggs in my incubator, so it holds quite a bit. All right, so number 2, this is a con. You actually risk the snake crushing the eggs. And I actually haven't seen this on ball pythons. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen it once in a while with ball pythons, but it seems like it's a lot more common with really big snakes, especially with reticulated pythons. I've seen in a couple cases, as a matter of fact, I saw one reticulated python and the guy was trying to take the reticulated python off of the eggs, and the retic squashed the eggs and crushed them all because for some reason it just constricted around the eggs. And a lot of times I've actually seen where 1 or 2 eggs will fall off, and then the retic or a really big snake will set on the eggs and just kind of crush it and destroy those eggs and pretty much ruin those eggs as far as just laying on the eggs. And I'd say probably with ball pythons, I've only seen it ever maybe once or twice where an egg will fall out of the main clump of eggs and it'll get underneath the snake, and the snake snake. Sometimes if you actually have a really big ball python, it'll actually sit right on top of the egg and squash it, which I'd say in most cases you don't really have to worry about it. It's not really that common with ball pythons, but with really big snakes, it's definitely a risk. All right, so number 3, the female most likely won't eat during maternal incubation. And this is one of the big things, is where pretty much the number one reason why I don't do maternal incubation, because if you leave the female on the eggs, the female, a lot of times it'll go off of food. It kind of goes into almost like a defensive mode where it won't eat, and it's matter of fact that it gets kind of defensive a lot of times when you open it up and the ball python kind of comes out looking to defend those eggs. And the problem is it's almost like it's in a defense mode instead of a feeding mode. And what I like to do is I like to take those females off of the eggs and get them eating as soon as possible so you can get them back into condition for the following breeding season, which is pretty much the number one challenge. Breeding ball pythons, as far as, you know, the whole season lasts almost exactly 12 months, and you have to really stay on top of trying to feed your females as soon as they come off the eggs. And I've actually had some, as a matter of fact, I actually pulled some off last year, and some of my females ate within the first week after coming off their eggs. And keep in mind, ball python eggs actually take 2 months to incubate. So if you leave the female on there for 2 months, you're taking 2 months out of your season where that ball python most likely will not eat. Although I have seen in one case where they actually had an incubating female that was maternally incubating her eggs, and they were able to feed that ball python several meals during incubation, which I'd say is pretty unusual as far as trying to get a female ball python that's on eggs, trying to get it to eat. That's pretty tricky, I'd say, as far as what I've actually seen. All right, so number 4, I'd say this is another big one. It's difficult to control the temperature and the humidity with maternal incubation, and this is where a lot of people run into problem. As a matter of fact, I probably wouldn't do maternal incubation if your ambient humidity is really low. I've seen some people try to do it where it's down like 15 or 20% humidity as far as kind of the ambient humidity in the room, and a lot of times it's pretty tricky because you have to keep that humidity, I'd say, probably at least 65%. I've seen a lot of people where they've actually done it successfully, and their humidity as far as in their room and in the enclosure was anywhere from 65% all the way up to like 100% humidity in the enclosure. So it's a little bit tricky because the eggs can dry out, and it seems like if they dry out, they have a lower chance of survival if you really desiccate the eggs. And I've actually seen some people where they'll actually take the ball python and the eggs, and they'll put it in almost like an egg box in an incubator. They'll have this setup where they'll put it in an enclosure that is completely enclosed. A lot of times they'll stuff like sphagnum moss all around the snake and the egg. Sometimes I've actually seen where they'll put a little paper over the snake and the eggs and just spray down the paper and keep it really humid. It's almost like having an egg box in an incubator, except you have the snake in there too, and it's not in the incubator. So it can be a little bit tricky as far as trying to keep the temperature and the humidity stable in the enclosure with the ball python female. All right, so number 5, it's kind of hard to know the hatch date because of the temperature fluctuations. And this is kind of interesting because I've actually seen, even in my incubator, I have a 6-foot tall incubator, and the eggs on the bottom of the incubator seems like it takes a lot longer for those to hatch than the eggs on the top. It can be within a few days of the hatch date. So a lot of times you're expecting the hatch date. Some people say they hatch about 55 days or something like that. Some people say 58. I've actually seen up here where I'm at, I actually live up here in the mountains of Colorado at 9,000 feet. I don't know if it has anything to do with the elevation, but as far as my setup, I've seen pretty much exactly 60 days as far as the kind of the average as far as the hatch date from the time you put them in the incubator to the time they hatch. And if you actually put them on the bottom of the incubator, they'll hatch like at 58 days, and then sometimes at the top of the incubator, sometimes they'll hatch at 60 or 61 days. And I think it really depends on the temperature fluctuation from the bottom of the incubator to the top of the incubator. My incubator is like 6 foot tall, and I've actually seen some people doing maternal incubation saying they didn't hatch until 70 days, which is kind of crazy. So sometimes you definitely don't want to give up if your eggs haven't hatched and you're doing maternal incubation. Sometimes, especially if you keep it below 90 degrees, they'll hatch quite a bit longer. It'll take quite a bit longer for those eggs to hatch. All right, so number 6, you actually have an increased risk with valuable clutches. And let me tell you, that's probably another reason that I don't do it, because just the risk involved as far as doing maternal incubation. I've seen a lot of people on the internet have some pretty good success, and then I've seen every now and then you'll see someone who'll have a big, huge clump of beautiful eggs, go through the whole maternal incubation, and out of all those eggs, they'll have just one snake hatch, which is, it's kind of discouraging if you kind of run into things like that. You start going through these things in your mind, you're like, all right, if I would have actually taken those eggs and put them in an egg box and put them in the incubator, I bet you probably could have had a better hatch rate versus doing something like that. Although I have seen a lot of people where they live in a tropical environment with really high humidity and an ambient temperature of like 80 to 82 degrees in the reptile room. It's almost like you can just take the eggs and put them up on the shelf. The conditions are almost perfect for the ball python eggs to hatch. Most people incubate about, I'd say about 88 degrees. I incubate it about 90 degrees as far as what I set my incubator to. But a lot of people will say, 80 to 82 degrees ambient temperature is a pretty good temperature as far as your reptile room. All right, so number 7, the eggs may not all be stuck together. So this is the other thing where if you're thinking about doing maternal incubation, you may want to try it and have an incubator standing by too. If you have an egg incubator, I've actually had some ball pythons where, most of the times they lay them in a really big clump where all the eggs are stuck together, and the ball python female can wrap around that whole clump of eggs. But every now and then you'll actually have one egg that's outside of the clump. Sometimes you get 1 or 2 eggs just kind of scattered around the tub, and then all the other eggs are kind of all together. And what I'd probably do is take the loose ones, put those in a separate incubator, and let the female just incubate all the ball python eggs that are stuck together. And every now and then I've actually had a ball python that'll just scatter all the eggs all over. It won't clump them together, and they won't just be, none of them will be stuck together. They'll just be kind of scattered through the whole tub. It's kind of, I'd say it's not really common that'll happen, but once in a while. In that case, I would probably take all those eggs and put them in an incubator versus trying to do maternal incubation. So number 8, it's hard to remove the bad eggs. So that's one of the things, when I actually have my females lay eggs, what I do is I go through all the eggs and I separate all the individual eggs and put them in an egg box where they're all completely separated. And that way, if you have an egg that goes bad, sometimes you'll have an egg that for whatever reason, it just kind of molds and goes bad and gets really nasty in there. And you definitely want to remove them. And I've actually seen a lot of people where they'll have a whole clump of ball python eggs, and then right in the middle, they'll have one go bad, right in the middle of incubation. And that always makes me nervous, because I always think, all right, if that one in the middle is bad, it can kind of spread to all the other ones around it. I like to separate them, so where if I have a bad one, I can remove it, maybe to another egg box, and then work on it, maybe do some antifungal powder or something to try to save that egg separate from all the other ones. And let me tell you, usually once an egg gets really super bad, most of the times you can't save it. I've had some really nasty eggs that have actually hatched, which is pretty surprising. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, usually if you have a real bad egg, you definitely have to pull it away from all the other eggs. And you really can't do that with maternal incubation, especially if you have a clump of eggs with the snake wrapped around it and it's right in the middle. It's kind of a challenging thing to do. Although you probably could, if you move the snake off and kind of worked the whole clump of eggs, you could probably get it out of there. But you'd have to check on it frequently instead of just completely ignoring it. All right, so number 9, the eggs in the incubator appear to be in better condition versus maternal incubation. This is another thing. If you actually go over to YouTube and you start looking up maternal incubation and you look at some of the condition of some of the eggs that the female has been on for 2 months. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen reticulated pythons. It takes 3 months for those eggs to hatch. And sometimes after 3 months or 2 months with a female ball python crawling around those eggs with all the substrate, it can get really dirty, really funky looking. A lot of times they can really desiccate. And if you actually compare the condition of those eggs compared to eggs that are pulled out, put in an egg box and properly incubated in an incubator. I've actually had some eggs that are, you know, like a month and a half old, still in the incubator, that look almost like the day they were laid. Really bright white, pristine, hardly desiccated at all, looking really good. And let me tell you, just looking at, you know, the incubator eggs versus the maternal incubation eggs, you'd probably want to go with an incubator. All right, so number 10, the females can be defensive during the incubation, and I think this could possibly stress out your females quite a bit. So every time you open the tub, I've actually seen this with a lot of people maternally incubating their eggs. When they open up the enclosure or go in and check out the female, a lot of times the female is in a defensive mode and it's not really happy. Let me tell you, it seems like it's a really long time for that female to possibly be pretty stressed out, not eating and always being in a defensive mode on those eggs for 2 months straight. So that is kind of the pros and cons. And if you ask me, hey, would you actually maternally incubate some of your ball python eggs? As a matter of fact, I actually had a question under one of my videos. It's one of the more popular questions I've had in a lot of my videos. People would ask me if I would actually do it, if I would maternally incubate my eggs. And I would say possibly I might do it, just because I recently changed to an all-room humidifier where I increase the humidity in my room. As a matter of fact, right now it's anywhere between probably 65 and 70% humidity here in my reptile room, so I could probably do it with the higher humidity. I mean, before this, I actually had about 15 to 20% humidity in my reptile room, and I was always chasing the enclosures and they were always drying out, and it was really difficult. As a matter of fact, usually when I have a ball python female lay some eggs and I don't get in there and get those eggs right away, a lot of times it's really obvious that they'll desiccate significantly when the humidity in my reptile room is about 20%. So I'd say with this 65% humidity in here, I probably could do it. Although I probably wouldn't, just because of the risk for some of my really expensive snakes. If I had kind of a lower end normal or something that I was breeding to something that was kind of lower end, I might actually do it. As a matter of fact, if I was doing it for like some kids or something, I think it would be a pretty interesting thing just to do it once, to have the ball python incubate their own eggs, just for, you know, kind of the visual appearance, to see the whole process of the snake doing it. But probably at this point, I probably wouldn't do maternal incubation in any of my ball pythons right now. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.